So, hello and welcome. My name is Radhika Desai. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group. The group started meeting amid the pandemic to analyze the fast-changing political economies of various countries around the world under the impact of the complex public health, economic, social, and political crises triggered but not caused by the pandemic, and the larger geopolitical economy that they composed. Today, we present another one of our panels, this time on the longer telegram. It was originally suggested by Jeffrey Summers, and he and I then worked to put it together with a good mix of people from different key countries around the world and key regions around the world. The longer telegram, as you know, is a document published by the Atlantic Council, which aspires to provide the Biden administration with its foreign policy framework in the context of the so-called new Cold War on China. We have decided to subtitle our panel first time as Fluke, second time as Flop, because its conscious emulation of George Kennan's long telegram is at least questionable from a variety of points of view. The fact is that despite its hallowed position in the US foreign policy firmament as the founding document of Cold War policy, neither was Kennan's analysis accurate, nor did the US foreign policy establishment conform to it. Kennan had portrayed the USSR as inherently and fanatically and neurotically expansionist, something that was far from the truth. Moreover, Kennan's recommendation that the US follow a policy of mere containment was hardly followed by it. Instead, the US made every effort to escalate the arms race, justifying it by arguing that every anti-imperialist revolution and movement that took place around the world was somehow backed and guided by Soviet power. Finally, Kennan himself distanced himself from his own recommendations soon after making them, and he never gained any influential position in the US foreign policy establishment. The long telegram's iconic status was therefore something of a fluke. The longer telegram, by comparison, promises to be a flop. There are so many questions it raises. Will the Biden administration pay any attention to its call for a more studied and less chaotic foreign policy towards China? Can it do so? Is its analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the US and China and of the balance of power between them across all its dimensions, economic, social, military, diplomatic, political, etc., even after taking into account its not inconsiderable appreciation of how much US power has declined since the mid-20th century? Is the so-called realistic assessment really realistic? How realistic are its expectations of allied cooperation? These and many other questions will be addressed by our panelists. We have 7 panelists in total, and I have requested them each to confine their remarks to about 9 or 10 minutes. So I feel that we will be done with the presentation part of our panel in about an hour and 15 minutes or so. And I will very briefly introduce the speakers as we go along. So the first speaker today will be, sorry, one second. The first speaker today will be Jeffrey Summers. Jeffrey is a professor of African and African diaspora studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and visiting professor at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. His research and teaching is conducted on the spatial fixes of crises to global capitalist accumulation, with a special focus on the Baltic states. Professor Summers has researched and criticized austerity policies to the 2008 global economic crises. So, Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Radhika. I'm delighted to be here with you, friends, and colleagues. By ethnicity, I'm German and Italian, and I have an appreciation that reflects that Germanness in terms of time, but my Italian side often prevents me from keeping good time. So I hate to offload work onto a woman, but a competent one such as yourself, I can trust. Keep me on time. If I'm not, cut me off. My remarks, I hope
this
to...
is a contradictory task. Okay.
I hope to keep my remarks under 9 or 10 minutes, but just first in terms of a little bit of background. Of course, China, we all know what it is. It's a country where, again, 40 years ago, 90% of the population lived in extreme poverty. Only 1% does today. A nation whose economy, when we correct GDP for the fake wealth of finance, is already the largest in the world. But now in this kind of Rip Van Winkle fashion, the United States, after 2 decades of slumber on China, while it was sleepwalking the past 2 decades, trashing Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, etc., seems to have reawakened to the China threat. And so here we have the author of the longer telegram lamenting the dereliction of duty of US leaders and not having had a consistent policy and attention paid to the past couple of decades to China for managing it, as if it is something to manage. And then proposes a long diagnosis of the current challenges China poses to the US and remedies for its redress. But foreign policy, like much of medicine, has been marked by actions taken that worsen the maladies under consideration rather than curing them. And thus, in this instance, the US would be better served by taking cues from Hippocrates and his counsel, of course, to first do no harm, which, of course, in recent decades, the United States has done anything but in terms of its destabilizing activities in many parts of the world, violating the Hippocratic Oath in the most crude and invasive procedures to fix the problems of the world system by making use of a kind of US Civil War's surgeon rusty saw. And the results have been predictably bloody, with gangrene setting in the aftermath of the procedures rather than robust health. So hopefully we won't see anything similar with respect to China. The report itself is, as we know, as is advertised in its title itself, long, coming in at some 500% in excess of the length of Kennan's original long telegram. It's a kind of flabby pastiche of contradictions. Among them, it calls for massively rebuilding US infrastructure while at the same time managing the US debt and preventing inflation. So it's a kind of veritable frictionless environment in which the laws of physics, not to mention economics, are rendered inoperable. It's kind of a fantasy world. It also presupposes capabilities the US no longer possesses, and building or restoring ones that in the current environment really cannot be made. The biggest challenge faced by the US, arguably, is a political one, and one previously identified by leaders as diverse as George Washington to Joseph Stalin, and that is factionalism. The US arguably has not been this divided since it was on the cusp of its civil war in 1861. Yet the author of the longer telegram calls for a kind of Cold War-like political unity, at least on the issue of foreign policy, one which is unlikely to be found. As I commented in an article which was commissioned by Radhika just a few months ago, whatever one thinks of Russian sociologist Alexander Dugin, he was among the first to grasp the reality of 21st century politics, one that would be marked by the collapse of the center. And in the US, we see neoliberalism having destroyed what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. argued was the very source of the United States' vitality and stability. And that was, as he called it, the vital center. Politically, nothing has been resolved, even by the election of Joseph Biden. And right now, we see a still kind of deadly, grotesque carnival politics in the United States that's amplified by social media rather than being muted by it. In fact, most recently, we've had Francis Fukuyama and others call for an increased use of broadband internet and social media that it would enable to somehow enlighten and inform the electorate. Well, fat chance that's going to happen. I think it's just going to increase the speed by which they can have their Alex Jones feed brought into their homes. So a kind of civilization and discontent, irrationality has been unleashed. Paranoia and aggression are off the charts. And that is the political environment and moment that we see in the United States. But what are the United States' strengths, both perceived and real, in terms of how it can be handling and managing its relations with China? How is it equipped to do so? Well, of course, one is finance. And as I suspect Georgi will talk about this more, maybe not, but in the kind of late stage hegemonic phase that the United States, pace, I guess, Giovanni Arrighi, that we see the United States in, it has developed a strength, as we all know, in finance. And so the author of the Longer Telegram tells us that we are to retain that strength in finance. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, ensuring that, of course, we keep control over the SWIFT system of payments and dollar clearance that will give the United States continued leverage over all others. But here we see that China is already building its digital currency system in parallel to the US system, and will eventually be able to do an end run possibly around it. But also in terms of China's advantages, we see the absence in China of any significant debt to the United States. This is an inheritance from Mao. He was deathly afraid of getting into debt traps, and China has continued that. In terms of international debt, domestic debt is an entirely different matter. But this underscores a contradiction, and that is that this very strength in finance is what has undermined the United States' real economy. So this weapon, this financial weapon that can be used internationally, is something that has also been reflective of a war on US production and the United States' real economy, as the East Coast Wall Street economy rent seeks off of the productive sector of the American economy. So it is as much a danger to the United States as it is a weapon that can be used against others. The other great strength of the United States, of course, is its military. But this, of course, brings to mind Graham Allison and his analogy of the Thucydides trap, of which the United States might fall into. And in this current moment of paranoid politics, represents perhaps a greater danger than ever, and that is running into a real conflict with China. Now, the United States still has the capacity to unleash a world of pain on anyone that it wants, but China can actually return that pain. So it's really not a credible instrument for control to use against China. And when it comes to China's immediate vicinity, the United States really has no way to impose its will. And in the war games that have been played out in the East, rather than the South China Sea and other areas, it always results in nuclear war. The other area of strength is the United States and its digital economy and its desire to impose an intellectual property regime that will retain the flow of rents to the United States. But here, China has made great advance as well. And by the way, China, rather than opposing IPR, actually is a big defender of it. And the reason being is that it sees its future as one of being the world's chief exporter of technology, and it is working quite adroitly to protect that in the future. So the United States could get sidelined by its own game there as well. In conclusion, the United States lacks the strengths to control or manage China, and it would be, of course, much better off if it just learned to live with it and not think that it could, like the proverbial child in the or rather, more preferentially, like the proverbial child in the amusement park ride, just be in this car with a fake steering wheel that really doesn't control anything. As long as it doesn't actually try and control anything, it'll be okay. If it does try and control anything, it's going to be a big world of pain for everyone. I'll conclude my remarks there and look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Fantastic, Jeffrey. I think we, between us, managed to keep you on time. Okay, so with apologies to the panelists, I'm going to vary the order just for one speaker because he has to leave early. So our next speaker will be George Delugian, and then we will follow the order that I had given the panelists originally. So George is Professor of Social Research and Public Policy at the New York University, Abu Dhabi. He first studied African languages at Moscow State University, and George saw his first war in Mozambique in the 1980s. Having returned from Africa to Moscow in 1989, he noted with astonishment that parts of the unraveling of the Soviet Union were rapidly coming to resemble Africa's politics of corruption and civil wars. George's first-hand study of the Soviet collapse was published as the award-winning book Bourdieu's, very cryptically entitled Bourdieu's Secret Admirer in the Caucasus. George has also taught at Northwestern University in the United States and has been a visiting professor at Sciences Po and the Université de Bordeaux in France, as well as Tallinn Technological University in Estonia and Kiev State University in the Ukraine. So George, the floor is yours once again for 9 or 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Just the list of my employment, took a minute. Jeffrey, you realize, of course, that your analysis sounded strikingly similar to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and his prescriptions. Because that was a call which was not heard in the optimism, American optimism or triumphalism of the late 1980s for caution, and also prediction that wars would continue. Francis Fukuyama actually won the competition at the time, 30 years ago, to remind you, with Samuel Huntington remaining actually very widely read across Asia. So a friend of mine, a co-author, joked that if we are ever to write a book on Islamic fundamentalists or on jihadis, there must be a chapter simply called Huntington. Because this is really, the inspiration, but not only. So let me take you back 500 years to the beginning of this world system to remind you, what was going on and how strikingly different, or maybe similar, it looked like at around 1500. So imagine that The Economist magazine had existed at the time in the 16th century. Their January 1500 issues or Arabic, and their global pundits would all agree on one thing: the dreadful Middle Ages are over. And this is thanks to gunpowder, which enabled the rise of new generation of empires. This is going to be an imperial age, and probably it's going to be also the age of Islam, because out of the major empires of the 16th century, 3 were Muslim, and they emerged almost simultaneously at exactly 1500. The Mughals in India, the Safavis in Iran, the Ottomans consolidated their final gains in the former Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, China, as always, was the first, the Ming Dynasty. The laggards included Russia, it was Muscovy at the time, and Japan. They would catch up towards the end of the century. And if you think that this is all Asian or Asiatic, think about the Habsburgs in Europe. We had similarly imperial, religiously conservative project. Should I remind you of Spanish Inquisition? And they were almost winning it, if not for the Protestant Reformation. So something happened very important in the 16th century, which disrupted this march of empires. And that was the emergence of the tiny Dutch Republic, which was the first hegemonic power. Hegemonic not in the sense that it was the biggest, or probably even the mightiest, but simply because, I remind you of the old book by Carlo Cipolla, Guns and Sails. All the empires had guns, but the Dutch put the guns on boats, on oceanic ships, and they must produce those oceanic ships very efficiently, which meant that they became kind of early modern Vikings. they could come and visit everyone else in the world, while the rest of the empires just could not march to visit them at home. So this is the phenomenon of capitalist Europe. So Europeans could come, and where they could, they simply conquered outright, like what happened with Aztecs and the Incas. Where they could not, they would trade, just like the Vikings before. The first great hegemonic power invented primarily how to internalize the cost of security. So these were capitalists, but not the first capitalists in history, but these were capitalists with guns, and enough guns and sails to protect themselves and impose themselves on the rest without paying some extra empire to protect them. The second big breakthrough, still, Dutch Republic, is quite small. The second big breakthrough was British. Of course, in the 19th century, they internalized the cost of production. The Dutch was still predominantly oceanic traders. The British became producers. We call it age of industrialization, but this was also the age of industrial imperialism, where they could outgun easily, the rest of the world. They were caught up with several new powers, which were capable of producing industrial imperialism at around 1900, but still, imagine, as the same Economist magazine, say, it already existed, in, say, June 1914. What would be their global forecast? British Empire would last forever. Quite obvious. It was like Titanic. It was unsinkable. And in fact, actually, some of the greatest catastrophes, meaning, the collapses of major structures, happened in the modern age, precisely where nobody among the rationally thinking politicians could have imagined one. So the first was the French Revolution. Who could ever seriously suggest to the political class of French kingdom that somebody like Robespierre in a couple of years could come to power in such a place? Precisely because nobody believed the prospect, Robespierre and the Jacobins could come to power for a while. The second was probably collapse of Soviet Union. Who could have believed in 1991 that the Soviet Union was going to collapse? And in the middle was World War I, which was very important because it made the whole 20th century possible by essentially producing a collective suicide in the center of the world system. So if you ever needed an argument about the dangers of capitalism, this system is on record historically, have committed suicide. It already did it once, massively. And it was saved uncannily, by two powers outside of Europe, by the United States going social democratic at the mid-20th century, and by Russian Empire going communist at the same time. This is what structured, the whole 20th century, and their collapse produced a very strange thing. They both internalized the cost of social reproduction, but only for themselves. So it was both military and industry, but also big society, but only for themselves, not for the rest of the world. The Marshall Plan was never meant for the whole world, and the Soviet Union, seriously speaking, never had, they didn't even try to project a world revolution. Seriously, they could not. So what happens, when first the Soviet Union and then the United States go into quite inevitable decline, because they produced the global landscape they could no longer manage. It's too big for them. What is going to be the next hegemony, as Giovanni Arrighi would have asked? It will have to be some kind of world government or none, or maybe world anarchy. So what do we see? Surprisingly, the return to 1500. As industry left for these special fixes in Asia, we see the hollowing of the middle in the West. But if industries are migrating somewhere, what is going to happen there? We keep it in different hemispheres, in one hemisphere of the globe and one hemisphere of our brain. But what is happening in China? What's happening in India? What's happening in Turkey, Iran? So we see the return of the 16th century empires, including perhaps even Ethiopia. or Burma, even the second ranks, Vietnam, and they're not going to be very nice, so it looks like, they are coming with vengeance. They're coming with their imperial pride, which, of course, when pride is imperial, it is called civilization. And what we're going to see is probably, an age of imperialism, but this time it is going to be Asian imperialism. Are we going to see more imperialist wars? Very likely. Is Asia going to commit suicide? So I wanted to turn the tables on you. So not being American-centric, but being Asia-centric. Is Asia going to produce something comparable to World War I? So this is my biggest fear, because I just look outside the window and I see Turkish tanks out there. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Georgi. That was a very interesting perspective, and I think you are drawing our attention to some parts of the story that might easily be neglected, but that are very important. So thanks very much. And it is very, I think it is very, the points that you raise are really very critical. Okay. Yeah, sorry. What I was going to say is it's very sad that you won't be there for the Q&A, but we'll have to have you back some other time. Okay, so our next speaker is Jenny Clegg. Jenny is an independent writer and researcher, former senior lecturer in international studies, and longtime China specialist. She is the author of China's Global Strategy Towards a Multipolar World, and an activist in the peace and anti-war movement in the UK. So Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Radhika. Thanks for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure for me to join this panel. Following the previous presentation, I should just wish to mention that gunpowder, of course, was one of the 4 great inventions that came from China. Now, my approach has been to try and get my head around the strategy in this document. I'm going to give a brief synopsis of the strategy and then add some of my own comments. So the document starts from the view that it's not now possible to overturn the Chinese Communist Party itself, and the US on its own cannot restrict the rise of China. Regime change, therefore, should aim to get rid of Xi Jinping and have him replaced by a more pro-market, less authoritarian, less nationalistic leadership, more like the preceding Hu Wen team, that was Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, who the document considers were prepared to accept US leadership of the international order. China then must be shown that the direction of the world is stacked against it, and there's no way its global ambitions can be realized. And this can only be done by forming the major US allies into a consolidated military and economic bloc. The strategy is about using leverage to put pressure on China's weak links, identified primarily as political discontent among the party elite and among the public. This is based on the idea of the ideological bankruptcy of Marxism-Leninism. And also I just would add that, of course, one of the strengths that is, one of the US strengths that's boasted here is that it's not a planned economy. Anyway, the document reckons that Xi Jinping has come under criticism from both a conservative nationalist wing of the party, which think he has been too bold and making too many risks, so provoking the US, and the liberal wing who feel China is forfeiting opportunities to take part in the international system. So out of his personal ambition to go down in history as a great leader, Xi Jinping is liable to force the pace, and this is where the leverage must be applied to tempt Xi to overplay his hand, take unnecessary risks, so earning international disopprobrium, creating more adversaries and alienating the Chinese middle classes. The modus operandi of the document is fourfold: to restrict, punish, compete, and cooperate under duress, I would add. This identifies responses to different types of behavior. First of all, red lines are drawn, which, if crossed, may lead to direct intervention. Then there are behaviors which must be deterred, not necessarily by military action, and behaviors that may be tolerated. And I'll just highlight some examples. Needless to say, the red lines cross China's red lines and are around Taiwan, South China Sea, and so on. So an effective Taiwanese national military deterrent is seen as a necessity. And what is notable in relation to Taiwan, actually, is the commitment to military action, not just against incursion, but against economic blockade by China or a serious cyber attack. Now, the question of cyber attack is actually now covered in both the US and UK military postures. In the South China Sea, the red lines rule out any further island reclamation and any actions to further militarize the situation. So this means things could escalate very quickly. For example, China is now aiming to arm its coast guards. And we should also note that China is also to be held responsible for any action North Korea takes involving WMD. Behavior to be deterred includes refusal to engage in nuclear arms reduction talks, belligerence, for example, against India, genocide, and competition includes using World Bank funds for infrastructure projects in emerging economies. Now, a key point for me is that there's a critical time to effect this rollback of China, which has to be in the next decade. So China aims to modernize its military by 2035, and the closer it reaches this goal, the more confident it will feel. So in other words, in the next 10 years, as we see the US attempting to wrong foot the Communist Party leadership, we have a very real prospect of war, maybe a conflict in the South China Sea or a major confrontation over Taiwan, with the US gambling that this will see the downfall of Xi Jinping. If there is not some confrontation before then and the winds continue to blow behind Xi Jinping's sails, then Taiwan may lose confidence in US support and come to a sensible settlement with China. So just now to move on to some comments. The assumption is that China is bent on a collision course with the United States as it seeks to become the dominant power. So it doesn't see any peaceful coexistence. And there's no grasp of the fact that despite all its twists and turns, the Chinese Communist Party has, since its inception, pursued a long-term strategy to realize a world of equal relations. Now, on the question of China's political fault lines, the assumption seems to be that Xi Jinping single-handedly hijacked the post-Mao system of collective leadership, pushing aside a liberal faction to impose a more statist approach on the economy. So yes, we know that the Chinese Communist Party is highly factionalized, but I think actually it was more of a collective decision to elevate a single leader around whom to unite the party and the country. And this, I think, was done for several reasons. One, because they knew that they would come under huge pressure from the United States. Secondly, the task ahead of upgrading and restructuring the economy is a massive challenge, risking social instability ahead. And thirdly, because of the experience of factional struggle over the leadership transition in 2012 with Bo Xilai. We also know that there are strong feelings amongst the public against the wealth of the so-called princeling families around the Communist Party. But nevertheless, of course, the support for the Chinese Communist Party amongst the population should not be underestimated. So would the CPC split, say, under pressure of the threat of war on Taiwan? And would, in that case, Xi Jinping be replaced by a more liberal or moderate faction? I have my doubts. Frankly, I think that it's far more likely to see the rise of nationalism. And there's virtually no mention in the document of the PLA, People's Liberation Army. It does seem now that the US and China are engaged in tit for tat. As Michael Clare says, it's a game of chicken. I do think that China is quite capable of making stupid mistakes. I was no fan of the Wolf Warriors. In exercising soft power, they're out of their comfort zone and can be pretty clumsy. They prefer the approach of people-to-people links, sister cities, culture exchanges, and so on. Nevertheless, China has now come out of its corner into the ring on human rights. This paid off when Yang Jiechi criticized the US for racism at Anchorage before the eyes of the whole world. On the other hand, of course, the exchange of sanctions has clearly unsettled EU-China relations. I'll just say a few words on nuclear arms negotiations if I've got enough time. China holds the view that since it has only 300 warheads, the US and Russia, which have thousands, should get on with reducing their numbers first. The collapse of the INF Treaty banning intermediate land-based missiles has added a new twist here since Trump was insisting that China joins negotiations for a new treaty. However, most of China's missiles are land-based, so this is out of the question. Instead, China has hinted that sea and air-based intermediate missiles should also be banned, which would restrict the US considerably. Now, I actually have more to say about the proposals on cooperation, which seem to be another way to isolate China and apply duress. And there's also obviously more to be said about what is actually happening under Biden, whether he's following the prescriptions here, but I'll leave those for the discussion and close my first remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. A model of restraint, and I think a very insightful presentation again. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Aliyek Barabanov. He is a Russian historian and political scientist and currently serves as program director of the Valdai International Discussion Club. He's also the professor at Moscow's famous MGIMO University. Aliyek, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, colleagues. It was quite interesting for me when I read the longer telegram first. It was surprisingly good for Russia. It was unimpossible to think for some American, some US strategists to write something good or at least constructive or positive on Russia now, after Crimea and after the chemical weapons and so on. But nevertheless, we'll see that one of the key recommendations of the longer telegram is that the United States should divide Russia and China. And I just quote from the text that US must rebalance its relationship with Russia, whether it likes it or not. So in that sense, the idea which was present in the US strategy to some extent before Ukraine and Crimea, to divide Russia and China and maybe to play with Russia against China, it seemed that it was absolutely dead after Ukraine. But now we have the resurrection of this idea. And there is a very clear proposal that it is in the vital interests of the United States itself to continue their more or less constructive relations with Russia, which is Russia of now, which is Russia of today, which is Russia of Vladimir Putin after Crimea, after poisoning, and so on. And that is, frankly speaking, exactly the same logic that some people within the Kremlin establishment think. And frankly speaking, they say, forget us Crimea, forget us chemical poisoning, and we will be back. We will be back with you, we'll be good again. So that's exactly their proposal, and I would say a temptation from the longer telegram towards Russia in this sphere, and it is clearly realist if we could find some theoretical approach for it. It's a kind of Kissinger or post-Kissinger way of thinking in the triangle US, Russia, China. The United States must have somebody as they are not ally but partner in this triangle. In the Kissinger times, it was China plus US versus Russia. Now the idea is the opposite. And in that sense, I think that maybe this text was written from the realist point of view, and maybe from a person closer to the Republican Party than to the Democratic Party, which is quite interesting, but it is my subjective observation. But if it was written by a Republican, so this would clear for us the question how Biden would react to it. And I think that the White House can know quite easily the name of the author of the longer telegram, so it's there is no anonymity for the White House people. And if the text is Republican or written by a Republican, so it will not be followed by the democratic establishment now. Another point, there are also, I agree with Jenny that there are recall for cooperation under duress for China. But still there are some sticks and carrots, yeah, because the longer telegram says that return back as you were before Xi Jinping. So be the normal part of the economic globalization. Forget about geopolitics and all will be okay. And in that sense, it could be a quite significant temptation for the Chinese elites to choose between economic gains if they turn back to the United States-led globalization and so on. And this is from one side, and from the other side, the geopolitical gains, but with economic losses. And that is exactly some of the historical background of the longer telegram. In the introduction, the author says that China learned the lessons from the Soviet Union, that China will be not weak inside, that China will not collapse in some parts like Soviet Union collapsed. That's true. China, PRC, they learned quite well the Soviet lessons and Gorbachev's lessons, how not to manage the democratic transition and so on. But I think that the Chinese could learn the Russian lessons not from only 1991, but from 2014 as well. Because with Ukraine and Crimea, I think the Chinese could understand that this dilemma between economic profits and geopolitical profits and the selection which was made by Russia, by the Kremlin in 2014, was in clear favor of geopolitical gains, but at a huge economic financial price with sanctions, with other things and so on. But if we presume that the Chinese are smart enough to learn all Russian lessons, they could be tempted not to follow the Russian behavior of Ukraine and Crimea, and so not to push on the geopolitical sphere instead of the economic profits and gains. And I agree that there is not too much preconditions now for the internal breakup of the Chinese within the Chinese elite, within the Communist Party leadership. But this could be exactly a temptation for the Chinese elite, which way to follow to gain more and more billions of dollars, or to become the geopolitical leader of the world and losing dollars, at least at the first stage of the average. So it was exactly this kind of temptation I see as a carrot within the text, within the longer telegram for the Chinese, which could be quite dangerous for their hardliners, quite dangerous for their hardline faction, and so on. What next about sticks? It's another point because one of the elements of the price that Russia paid for the Ukraine and Crimea is the fact that Russia became toxic, and we can see that we can say that okay, it's the information war, it's a hybrid information war. But this is the fact, and we see quite clear that Russia is demonized globally in the Western and the US media now, that many US experts are really afraid to cooperate with Russian partners now. And the question is whether this way of toxicity would enlarge to China as well. Trump started it already, but in a kind of chaotic way from my point of view. If this strategy to pose China as an absolutely toxic evil would be made by the US establishment and by the US media on the Russian example. So it would be the real and huge price for the Chinese instead of possible sanctions and so on. So this is the question of toxicity. And the last point, because I see that it's already 10 minutes for me, the last point is for values, because the longer telegram says about the values war with China, that the United States should promote the democratic values against China. But the question is, at least here we have the audience more or less connected with the left ideas, with the left political spectrum. The question is, what could be the real alternative in values for China and for Russia as well? Because both China and Russia are attractive as a symbolic alternative to the United States. And the Belt and Road initiative, it's not only that Xi Jinping was buying smaller countries in Asia and Africa, no. Many countries are in fact interested in the alternative values, in the alternative ideologies and so on. But the problem is, the question is how to find positive values. What is it in the Chinese values list except the anti-Americanism? If we think on it deeply, we cannot find almost nothing for Russia as well. So that I stop here.
Thank you so much, Aliyek. Okay, we now move right on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Bhadrakumar Melkulangara, or Bhadran for short. He's based in Kerala in India. He's a former career diplomat. He was an ambassador working on the territories of the former Soviet Union and was head of the Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan division and the Kashmir unit of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. After retiring, he has been a writer and columnist for the past 2 decades and has contributed to many Indian and foreign publications. He writes on Indian foreign policy and on his blog, Indian Punchline. So Bhadran, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone. Radhika, you mentioned that I do not belong to the world of academia, and my expertise and my profession has been in the world of diplomacy. So I step aside and take a different view of it naturally. First of all, I have a long exposure to the Soviet Union. I was posted there during the Soviet era, twice in fact. And I have an understanding of Biden, which may have some relevance here. I mentioned this at the outset because unlike any of his predecessors in the post-Cold War era, or even before that, he's different in the sense that he comes with a wealth of experience. And he's also someone with a continuous involvement in the world of diplomacy for something like 3 to 4 decades. In fact, his first visit was in the 70s to the Soviet Union. He has views, opinions, and he has his own thinking about these matters. I don't know whether we should ascribe, therefore, a larger-than-life importance to the longer telegram. That's the first point I would like to mention. I get a sense that if and when Xi Jinping and Biden meet, there may be an entirely different alchemy. And let's not be surprised about it. I don't think that even his own foreign policy team can set the tempo of the relationship with China. Biden will ultimately decide himself. And therefore, I begin with this, that what are his compulsions? His compulsions, I see, are primarily not in the esoteric world of geopolitics, but in the domestic internal matters. And that is where, the future of his party, the future of the US political system, the US economy, everything is devolving upon that. And therefore, it is inevitable that sooner or later, he is going to rationalize his approach to China in terms of China's utility to his agenda. We already know that climate change is one area where the US will critically depend on China's cooperation. We still do not know to what extent in the economic recovery, particularly in infrastructure development, in job creation, and so on, there could be a change in thinking that China could be useful for the Biden administration. So this is only illustrating the point. What I'm trying to say is that, these are early days and it's difficult, and America has a long tradition of being inconsistent. Flip-flops happen. And particularly in the great power relationships, we have seen there's a whole history, during the Cold War era. Therefore, we need to look at these things with caveat. That is the point I'm making. Now, I intend to touch on two issues here, primarily, two clusters rather. One is in terms of a China strategy on the part of the United States. You see, there is a bipartisan consensus in China, everyone says, with regard to this kind of hardline course towards China. But it's quite clear US has an attitude toward China, an attitude which is probably bordering on hostility. But what is the strategy to pursue such a course? That is the point here. None of the speakers above has given any importance to the Asian countries. Now, we must understand that that is the theater where this struggle is going to unfold. And in that theater, the fact of the matter is that hardly anyone is willing to take sides. In terms of the Asian countries, even Japan for that matter, is ambivalent. The previous administration, Mike Pompeo, tried his level best to see, for example, into this so-called format called Quad, which is spearheading the containment strategy in a way in that region, whether Vietnam could be baited to join it. Vietnam just said no, very plainly said no, they are not interested. So I'm not touching, in fact, other countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on within the ASEAN. Now, we have to accept it that ASEAN has a centrality in any kind of purposive containment strategy towards China. And if ASEAN is lukewarm in this way, how does the US work? US is going to send all those troops there and fight their way into China and depose the regime and so on. I don't see this at all happening. This scenario that the longer telegram is saying. Come to the European allies, even amongst the European allies, I really doubt to what extent they are interested in this sort of adventure. They are exhausted, as we can see, and barely coping with the pandemic. And these are democratic governments, elected governments, which are ultimately answerable to the public opinion. And they are not, this approach to China is certainly not the priority on the part of Angela Merkel. It's quite clear that German prosperity, German economy, German exports, China is a very important interlocutor. And we can see that. We can see that from the conversation that Xi Jinping had with Angela Merkel. So you see, when you come to even Russia, for that matter, I saw in the Axios today that Rodyansky is being considered for the post of director for Russia on the NSC. Now, that's a very, very significant choice because he's been one person. I don't know whether Axios and others are trying to shoot down this appointment. This happens, this kind of dogfight happens all the time in Washington. But assuming that it is seriously under consideration, it itself shows that, into the third month, the Biden administration is already having a rethink on the China policy, on the Russia policy. What is the kind of Russia policy it can have in terms of even a Kissingerian approach to create a divide between Russia and China? I don't think it is realistic because Russia is not looking for a few crumbs from the American table. Russia will want its independent relationships with the European countries. Is the United States in a position to concede, for example, a real warming up of relationship between Berlin and Moscow and the two countries pulling on together and setting the momentum, in fact, for European politics, Eurasian politics? I don't see the United States is ever going to allow that to happen because it will put a dagger on the back of its transatlantic leadership. On the NATO system itself, the NATO loses its logic. So, these are all very academic discussions when we speak about this of playing Russia against China and all the rest of it. The world is changed. Above all, we have to understand that compared to the Soviet era, containing China, isolating China, encircling China, I think we are already past that point because of its role as a driver of growth for the world economy. Soviet Union didn't have this good fortune, that this kind of extensive network all over the world. And therefore, if the US, in fact, goes hammer and tong at China in this way, it will rock the world economy. And how much of support the US will get for that thing? I come back to the pandemic. I see that in the next 2 to 3 years, the priority for everyone is licking the wounds and healing the wounds and putting life back together on a pedestal. And there we will see the end of the Biden's first term already. So I don't see this all happening at all this way. Now, I want to mention a few things about India. Unfortunately, there isn't much time. This is a very important aspect of life for us, the United States' approach toward China. But even in India, for example, our main preoccupation is with China. Therefore, the attitude that the US has and the strategy that US has impacts Indian interests, vital interests in a significant way. But in India, there is still, I can tell you, there is still a lot of skepticism whether, what kind of a policy is going to emerge at the end of the day. And therefore, we are not really hitching the wagons. We are keeping an independent line toward Beijing open, communication line open, and we are interacting with the Chinese. And we attribute great importance to the ASEAN's thinking on the matter, and we will not go separately. Now, if India, being a major power, is not going to be part of this containment strategy, where do the Americans get partners? Who are going to come? New Zealand and Australia? Other than that, I don't see anything happening. So we have to be very realistic about this, about the longer telegram. It's the realism there. Then finally, let me tell you also that China is not without deterrent power. And that deterrent power can be through means other than military confrontation. For example, North Korea can be a very serious problem for the correlation of forces in the Asia Pacific. Iran nuclear problem, how it is evolving. All these areas we can already see that China is in a position to be either a spoiler or a collaborator or a passive observer. So any of these roles China can play at will. And therefore, China has a lot of deterrent power other than the military power on the diplomatic and political side. Finally, just one word. I'm talking in front of a lot of experts on China, but I have traveled extensively in China. And I get the impression that the Communist Party has a certain legitimacy. And that legitimacy ultimately depends on its capacity to deliver a better life for the people. And in the West, it is not understood because, you know, this upliftment of people from poverty to middle class, you know, it's happened in an amazing way in China. And you talk to any Chinese, you know, his priority is in terms of a better life, that his children can live a better life and so on. So I don't think within the Communist Party, Xi Jinping is going to be measured in terms of, you know, the China's America policy. So bringing him down is going to be quite difficult so long as the Communist Party remains legitimate, enjoys a substantial popular base, and more than that, this economic restructuring is going to be successful or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Badran. That's really great. You've already raised lots of questions about the possibility of the reliance on allies working in the case of India and Japan. And our next two speakers are going to fill in the other critical part of it, which is the alliances with the European countries. So our next speaker is Brie, who's based in Berlin. He's the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and has recently authored Rediscovering Lenin, Dialectics of Revolution and Metaphysics of Domination, and along with Jörn Schütrumpf, a biography of Rosa Luxemburg entitled Revolutionary Marxist at the Limits of Marxism. So Misha, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello to everybody. I really appreciate to have the opportunity to share my views with you. Of course, the previous speaker, I have to thank, really is totally right. One thing are the papers written by strategic analysts. The others is real politics, of course. On the other hand, looking on the dialogue or whatever it was in Anchorage, we see how the relations between China and the US are in a very special moment now. I want to make 3 points. The first point is if we are in the famous long telegram of Kennan in 1946, Kennan wrote to the American administration, please note that premises on which this party line of the Soviet leadership is based are for most part simply not true. And I would say, if we are looking on the premises of the authors of the longer telegram, one can say also their premises are totally untrue. Why? The longer telegram sets, I think, a completely, and this is dangerous, unrealistic goal for the US and insinuates goals to the leadership of the Communist Party of China that this leadership does not have and cannot have. Thus, it proposes a strategy to the US that is, in a double sense, totally misleading. On the one hand, it is proposed that the US has to provide, I'm quoting, effective global leadership for the century ahead, yeah? And to stabilize the US-led liberal international system globally in the next century. And this task, as I think all speakers and all who are taking part in this session know, this is a task beyond the ability of the US. It's not only rising of China, it's the rising of India, it's the rising of a lot of other powers around the world. So we are in a completely new situation. On the other hand, it is assumed that China wants to build a China-centric global system. And this is totally, it is a vision the Chinese leadership or the Chinese people do not have. But by this, China is presented, and this is a little bit like Kennan was presenting, and Radhika, you mentioned it,
Hi, Sylvie.
the Union as an adversary for peace and cooperation, at the expansionist, revisionist power. I do not want to quote now Xi Jinping, but we have just, as our foundation has just made a research on the presentation of China in the German media. And what is totally interesting is that there are a lot of discussions on China, articles on China, comments on China, and so on, but almost never the Chinese scientists, scholars, the Chinese people, or the Chinese leadership itself is quoted. It's just talking about them, but never giving them their own voice. And this is unbelievable. Yeah? And my father was a diplomat for the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in China for a long time, since the 1950s. And he was totally aware that to understand China, you must go back. And what Xi Jinping and the Chinese people, I think, for them, what is the most important task is not to be the center of the world or the new superpower, but what they are all the time speaking about is the rejuvenation of China as a great civilizational state. And this should be taken seriously as the main aim. And you, Jenny, have written about this extensively. Yeah? So this was my first point. I just want to add, if the US leadership on the one hand is setting unrealistic goals, and on the other hand would imply to China's leadership goals that must plunge China into an antagonistic conflict with the US and all the other major powers. This puts, and this is very dangerous, we have seen it in Anchorage, this puts all sides involved in a very dangerous and unstable situation. Every action of the other appears either disconnected from real possibilities or disconnected from the real intentions of the other, or both. And this is precisely a situation that sinks orders into chaos and may sink worlds into war. So I'm coming to my second point. The longer telegram, I think, fails totally to address the most important tasks the US is facing. It does not give a realistic interpretation of the strategic situation. I have looked back into a book of Brzezinski 25 years ago, The Great Chessboard. Yeah? And he was aware, at this time, 25 years, a quarter of a century ago, he said, we, the US, have a very limited time to act wisely, because we have to prepare. We are the last superpower. After us, no superpower will be. And we have on the one hand, to use this superpower to transform it, to help to transform the whole global system into a system without any superpower. A multipolar system with multilateral rules of cooperation. And I think this is the task the US, China, India, European Union, and the others have to face. Yeah, this is a real task, and not to support the US to keep their unilateral, already diminished imperial power in the field of technology, economy, ideology, military, and so on. So I'm
1 minute, Misha.
I'm coming to my last point. It's about the Federal Republic of Germany and the European Union. We are faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, we are offered from the new US administration the possibility to cooperate in this anti-China politics and gain by this. On the other hand, this would demand from Germany, but also from the European Union to disregard most important core interests. So there's a deep contradiction. Just Radhika, one last remark on this. If you are looking on the paper, on the longer telegram, it of course also opens opportunities, as our Russian colleagues spoke about. Yeah? So there are ambiguities in this strategy, which is proposed by the longer telegram and maybe realized somehow also by the Biden and Blinken and so on administration, or by Yellen, the new Treasury Secretary, and so on. So I think from our point of view, from the European point of view, we should not follow this anti-China Cold War policy, but on the other hand, we should use some possibilities, some ambiguities of this new policy to get more cooperation, and maybe by this supporting this transformation of the world global system. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michel. And finally, we have Jean-Pierre Page, who is joining us from Paris. Jean-Pierre is a trade unionist, a former member of the National Executive Committee and head of the International Department of the CGT, which is the oldest confederation of trade unions in France. He has also been for almost 20 years a member of the Central Committee of the French Communist Party and has sat on the board of various research centers like the International Forum on Globalization in San Francisco, ISRES, and the National Institute of Research of the CGT. Jean-Pierre, the floor is yours.
I would like to start making two remarks. My first remark is when we speak about China and the longer telegram, we have also to speak about Russia, which are now considered, as you know, like as the two official enemies. It is interesting to note that more Russia is under attack, more they get closer to China. And for China, it's the same. And Kissinger used to say that the relations between US and China should be stronger than the relations between Russia and China. For this reason, I think the US is committing a huge mistake by targeting both Russia and China in the same time. Second remark, Michael Brie just quote Brzezinski. I would like to add something else. Brzezinski, in this famous book, The Grand Chessboard, underlined the strategic importance of preventing anti-hegemonic alliances. He said the US should fear an alliance between China and Russia, and worse, he said, an alliance between China and Russia and Iran. This is exactly what is happening now. If you look at the important statement issued by Lavrov and Wang Yi after the Anchorage meeting, and if you also take China-Iran strategic cooperation agreement, the Biden administration, I think, should see twice about those two characteristics of the balance of forces. Regarding China and what we speak about a new Cold War, this is what I think about it. Today, Biden considers China as the biggest threat to humanity in this century. So it is much more than a Cold War. For me, let's be clear, it's a war, full stop. In the long and the longer telegram, there is the enemy is communism, and it is also two visions, a unilateral world or a multilateral world. There is no way in between. However, in the longer telegram and in other documents of the Atlantic Council, the approach is more than ever ideological. This aspect is important if you compare to 1946 and the long telegram of George Kennan. His approach was very ideological. Almost 75 years later, it remained the same. It is like if the US was looking into a rear view mirror. After the fall of the Berlin Wall was declared the end of ideologies. But 30 years later, ideologies have returned as central to Washington geopolitical strategy. According to Biden, China is undermining the foundation of, I quote, the foundations of the economic global system. Today for the US, the challenge is more than regime change, is a system change in China. in my view, there is a difference between Pompeo and the present administration on how China should be handled. Pompeo was involved in a kind of an evangelist crusade. But now the longer telegram called for intervention in the internal life of the Communist Party of China against what they ironically called, I quote, the revisionist orientation of the leadership of Xi Jinping and his betrayal of the thought of Deng Xiaoping. The whole idea is to support, as it has been said, the more moderate tendency within the Communist Party against the Maoist Xi Jinping. And in a very dramatic way, the Atlantic Council, who played the role of prosecutor, considers that the problem is Marxism-Leninism, Communist Party, and also illiberalism in China. Therefore, it is more than containment or rollback of China's influence. Today, the US, for internal, as it has been said, I agree, for internal and external reasons, has to respond to the threat posed by China, whose economy is riding high, while the systemic crisis of the capitalist system shows clearly that things are not moving in favor of the West. China and Russia have become an internal problem for the United States. Jack Sullivan, the guy in charge of security, says recently, I quote, more people believe that the system in China is more efficient than ours. The reality is that the global balance of forces is moving and changing in favor of a multipolar world order and anti-hegemonic alliance.
1 minute, please.
Yeah. Oh. And the US have nothing to propose to their own people. In fact, it is a very conservative power. It is a kind of a failure, I would say. Dedollarization is an example, just like the deep existential crisis of Europe, it's alike. Today, for the US, the issue is not becoming an hegemonic power, but of maintaining its hegemonic power. So I have to go faster, I'm sorry. But the problem posed by Washington's ideological approach on China is in contradiction between rivalry and confrontation and the need to cooperate. For example, disindustrialization in the US and shift of manufacturing in China will make any decoupling almost impossible. The US is highly dependent on manufacturing industry in China. And I would like to quote this because I think it is important. Recently, the General Qiao Liang, who is in the director of the Center of Research on National Security in China, pointed out with regard to the struggle against the pandemic, that the US have patents for ventilators, but it doesn't have the capacity to produce ventilators. Out 1,400 pieces needed to produce a ventilator, 1,100 are manufactured in China, which also take care of the finishing process. So you may have high technology, like in the US, but without a manufacturing industry, how will you produce your technologies? How will you support your dollar and your army? And I could take another example like artificial intelligence. When you see the investment of China up to $70 billion a year and the US 11 billion a year, by 2035, everybody knows that China will become the leader of artificial intelligence. Just a few words and I finish. It is very well known that Americans are impatient, arrogant, and sure of themselves. whereas the Chinese are not only patient, but have another vision coherent with their long civilization and culture. They give time to time. And I would like to finish by quoting Sun Tzu in The Art of War. Sun Tzu said, war is like fire, and when it lasts, it endangers those who provoked it.
Thanks so much. So insightful, Jean-Pierre. And okay, so folks, thanks to the audience above all for being so so patient. But I think we've had an enormous number of insights, both from, in terms of the analysis of the internal divisions of the United States, its economic incapacity and debility, the difficulty of holding alliances together, and a whole lot more. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions. The best way of raising questions is if you would go to the reactions button and use the raise hand function. That would be the best. I also would like to say to the panelists, if they wish to pose questions to one another, that would also be good. And the only thing I would request is to try to keep your questions brief and to the point. This will allow us to have a longer and more extensive and more concentrated discussion. So I will keep a speakers list, and I will periodically announce who is on the list. So I have Dan Glazebrook. Dan, please go ahead.
Thanks. My internet connection is very bad, so it may be easier to just, if I type in the question, which is the question I typed in the chat earlier, but I will paste it again. So I'll just paste it again now, just correcting the typo. Yeah, there we go.
So you're just pasting it into the chat. Okay, so the question is, it seems to Dan, perhaps putting it a little crudely, that there is a cross-party consensus in the US to divide Russia and China. But in 2016, the Clinton camp favored courting China and isolating Russia, while Trump did the reverse. So Dan's question is this an accurate portrayal? Has Biden now been decisively won over to the Trump-Kissinger approach? And what are the class dynamics of these differing approaches? So that's one question. Aliyek would like to reply. So while I will normally take 2 or 3 questions altogether, but since we're still waiting for questions. Okay, in fact, I have one more question. David, please go ahead.
Yes, I have a question about the Ukraine, because Russia has threatened to cut Ukraine in half because over the Donbass,
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so Aliyek, I think you have a response, and please, other panelists, let me know if you have responses as well. Jeffrey, you have a response as well. So Aliyek, then Jeffrey.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And first I answer to Dan Glazebrook question. It's, in fact, there are 3 parts of the question. And I start with the third one about class dynamics. And there was also a similar question to me from Anna Maria Artner about class interests. So I would say if we are talking about this triangle, US, China, Russia, on the class base, at least if we'll see US-Russia relations now, let's just remind the classic the classic work of Vladimir Lenin about imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. And this is in fact what we'll see between the US and Russia is practically the imperialist war of 2 various kinds of imperialisms trying to hegemonize themselves. Now we use a more subtle theory behind it. It's the theory or concept of revisionist powers, as in fact the longer telegram text is about China becoming revisionist. So from the class point of view, from the Marxist point of view, there is nothing different between the US and Russia. And the question is whether China is expressing still Marxist working class interests in the global arena now, or if we just remind Leon Trotsky's expression on Stalinist transformation of the Soviet Union from socialist into state capitalist state. And if we think on China as a state capitalist power, there is in fact nothing of class difference among the three. But if we think on China as a Marxist or at least post-Marxist state, so we can divide it maybe not on the class basis, but on the ideologies and values basis. So left against the right, because Russia is definitely on the right. Vladimir Putin's regime is definitely on the right. China is using left liberational rhetorics at least, and they are quite normal for them to use it. If we express that the Biden-Harris administration are on the left too, and expressing at least left liberal ideologies. So we can see the difference between three ideologies: the right-wing populism by Vladimir Putin, left liberal ideologies and values by Joe Biden, and left liberational, at least a mimicry of left liberational rhetorics by China. So that would be my answer on class and ideologies. And two other parts of Dan's questions on the Kissinger triangle. Yes, you are quite right that after Ukraine, Obama was in favor of China, Clinton was also more in favor of China, Trump was trying to balance it for him, China was the enemy number one, and so on. But I'd like to say that the Chinese, from my subjective point of view, they were extremely happy after Ukraine, after 2014, because after Ukraine, Russia became the enemy number one for the United States, the clear enemy number one. And so China was behind Russia. And the so-called peaceful rising of China, or whatever you name it, was quite calm and quite unpressed behind Russia. So Trump tried to change this. It was not that successful. And maybe the main problem is in the Kissinger triangle, where the United States would be able strategically, militarily, economically, to press both China and Russia. So not to choose the enemy number one and enemy number two / partner, like it was Kissinger's proposal. But they would press with the same force, with the same animosity, both China and Russia. And whether could be a successful strategy for the US. And maybe a remark on Matthew Rozhansky, what Ambassador Bhadra Kumar said. I know Matthew personally, I've met him several times on various conferences. But the question is, yes, he is considered more or less on a softer part of the US establishment on Russia. And maybe linking it with the Ukrainian question, yeah? But Matthew is a kind of a Western expert, which when comes to Russia, when attends a Russian conference, he is speaking soft words in pleasure for the Russian organizers. But the next week or the next month, he comes to Ukraine and speaking harder words, which are in pleasure to the Ukrainian establishment. It is not only the question of Matthew personally, it's the same thing was with Michael McFaul who in the 90s worked in Moscow, in the Moscow Carnegie Center. And when he was promoted to the US ambassador in Moscow by President Obama, some people thought at least he understands us, at least he could understand our real limitations and so on in Russia. But it was not realized because Michael McFaul promoted rather hard line on Russia. So in that sense, I would be cautious on Matthew Rozhansky. So I hope also that he could follow more softer line on Russia, but I would not be absolutely surprised if he will not.
Thank you, Oleg. I have Jeffrey, I have Badran who wants to go next. And okay, Jeffrey and then Badran. Go ahead.
I don't have too many dissenting points from Oleg, but I published an article some 4 years back in the World Financial Review regarding just this question. And it's not just Kissinger, I mean, it was really Steve Bannon at the outset of the Trump administration, and even actually, even before taking power, that had articulated this policy of improving relations with Russia, because Bannon was predicting US war with China within a decade. He wanted to keep Russia on the sidelines, and it was predicting war with Iran even sooner than that. And for the same reason, wanted Russia cooperating with the United States, not perhaps as an ally, but at least not as an antagonist. But of course, none of this suggested forming anything like an alliance with Russia. And in fact, the United States was quite firm in its resolve to try and use energy policy, for instance, as a way to further its influence in Europe and to combat Russia on this wherever it could, even during the Trump administration.
Great, thank you. And Badran, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Radhika. You know, I briefly want to make a couple of remarks on this US, Russia, China. You know, this triangle is a relic of the Cold War era. You know, it's a very tantalizing proposition in intellectual terms. But actually, it has become an esoteric subject. I think in today's circumstances, we need to realize that this triangle is no longer going to work in the way, you know, that we are used to in the Cold War era, particularly after Kissinger's mission to China. Things are different. Now, Russia has independent foreign policies. If the United States is going to make a partnership with Russia, let's look at the details. Does it concede an independent and equal relationship and an independent foreign policy for Russia? It will never do that, because Russia today is different. It is not imposing ideologies on other countries. It is not, fighting proxy wars with the Americans or anything. It has independent foreign policies. Now, secondly, as I mentioned also briefly, there is going to be a very serious problem in the United States' relationship with Europe if the enemy image is taken out. You know, the NATO balloon gets punctured immediately. It has no rationale after that. And then Russia is, because of its independent foreign policy, Russia already has fairly steady bilateral relations with a few European countries already, including major European countries. And even France concedes that engaging Russia directly is very important. So, you know, United States will be in very serious trouble in its transatlantic partnership. If it has, on the other hand, if it just unshackles Russia, it needs Russia in an enemy image. Then finally, let me tell you one thing, that you know, the relationship between Russia and China is qualitatively different today. It has got a lot of content, and both sides realize rather that it is to mutual benefit. And that relationship, for instance, the partnership with China is irreplaceable for Russia, and the kind of strategic depth it gives for China is seamless. So both sides appreciate it, and at the highest level of leadership, there is a tremendous understanding, you know, that we have to see. And if Xi Jinping is so unpalatable for the author of the longer telegram, what about Putin? Now, a partnership with Russia you build with Putin in power, preposterous. It's such a toxic subject in the American, on the American side, you know. So I think let's just forget it. The Logler telegram, when I read it, I found that it is most flawed in this respect, that it is pinning hopes on a very mythical, delusional proposition. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, to add to that, I think it is also extremely flawed on its assessment of America's economic strengths. As various people have pointed out, America's economy is actually quite in an advanced stage of debilitation compared to what it was back in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, I have 3 questions, but I also wanted to say, Mick, I know you have to go. Do you want to pose your question before you go? No, okay, fine. So I have Mateusz Piskorski first, and then John Ross, and then Alan Freeman. So Mateusz, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce myself. I'm a political scientist from Poland, and I have just 2 short questions. One is addressed to Professor Baranov from Russia. The question is about his assessment of the speeches made by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping at the last World Economic Forum in Davos. I mean, could we say that the parts of those speeches of both leaders of China and Russia were somehow, let's say, a basis or a start of a new ideological proposition? Because Professor Barabanov told that there's no ideology, I mean alternative ideology for the US neoliberalism and globalism. So this would be the first question. And the second question to Jenny Clegg is about the relations between the so-called Komsomol group, the former youth organization of the Chinese Communist Party, and the US Democrats. Is it true, according to you, that there are close ties and very close relations between this very powerful part of the Chinese Communist Party, coming from the Komsomol, from the youth organization, and some parts of the globalist elites of the American Democratic Party? Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Mateusz. John, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, my question is for Oleg. Just to explain my background, I'm senior fellow at Shenyang Institute for Financial Studies in Beijing, which means I've been working in China for the last, let me work it out, 12 years. But also from 1992 to 2000, I lived in Moscow. So therefore I have experienced both of the Russian aspect of this and of the Chinese aspect. Right. I went to Russia because I wrote an article called Why the Economic Reform Will Succeed in China and Fail in Russia, the thesis of which is completely self-explanatory. This seems to me that the question that Oleg doesn't address, and I want to hear his views on, which is the Achilles heel of Russia is the complete failure of its economic policy since 1991. Whatever it benefited in short term from the commodity boom in around 2000 to 2014, but if you leave that aside, the actual per capita growth rate of Russia since 1991 is lower than under Brezhnev. So if we're going to talk of a period of stagnation, the period of stagnation is the period since 1991. And this is what creates the problems. Now, it seems to me that for different reasons, China, of course, has never endorsed the neoliberal policies, which were behind shock therapy and Russian policy, so that's no problem. But the US is beginning to break with them. I mean, we will have to see whether Biden can actually get his infrastructure bills and things through Congress. This is not certain. But at the ideological level, it's a huge break. It's a break which says, basically, we're going to have an industrial policy, we're going to have massive state intervention into the economy. And Russia remains slightly an isolated aspect of neoliberalism. And this is the Achilles heel of Putin. Whatever he has delivered on the question of Crimea or in the Ukraine, which is very important geopolitically, there's been a total failure to sort out the questions of the economy. Whereas, of course, China continues to be extremely dynamic. So I really want to ask Oleg what he thinks is the realistic chances of Russia being able to break out of this situation where it's been able to squeeze between China and the United States, if you want to put it that way, by adopting a different type of economic policy, or whether he thinks there's no possibility of that in the coming period. Oh, finally, one sentence. On the question of China's ideology, in my opinion, it'll be the question of human rights. If you look at it from the point of view of China, in the last year, it saved its population from the death from COVID compared to the catastrophe in the United States, and it's revived its economy. But that's a different question. My real question is to Oleg.
Okay, thanks, John. I have Alan, and then I have we will end this round of questions with Alan, and then I'll take Bruno, Jean-Pierre, and other questions in the next round. Alan, please go ahead. Alan, you're muted.
May I briefly share my screen? I've only got 2 graphs, but if you make me the host, I can do that.
Okay, hang on. There you go. Done.
Okay, let's try again. Okay, share screen. Okay. I just want to refer to the economics of what is going on, because I think there's been some mention of this, but I think it's a very important thing to understand, and I'd like any of the participants who want to talk about this to deal with this. This is a simple graph I calculated, which showed what is happening to the North, the global North's share of growth. And by the way, America, the whole Europe, Japan are all proceeding at the same rate. So everything that's being said here about the North applies to the United States, applies to Europe, applies to Japan. So what you see on the left is what would actually happened, which is the share of growth of the North has, reduced to 1/3 of what it used to be. The second is a very simple calculation. What would it be if the North had grown at the same rate as in 1960 to 70? And you would see that there's virtually no change. Now, why is this important? Because what's going on is a self-inflicted economic crisis. So to me, it seems very dangerous, because America blames the rise of China and the global South for what's happening to its own economy, but it is entirely responsible for what is happening to its own economy. So it can thrash around as much as it wants, trying to slow China down, and that's the big risk, which John and others have pointed to. But it can't halt its own decline unless it radically changes the nature of its own economy. And there's a second graph here, which I hope shows this. This is the average rate of growth of the global North since 1951. And it's a persistent decline. Many people have said, there was a boom in 1980. There was no boom in 1980, right? In the 1960s, it was about 5%. In the 1970s, it was about 3%. And it's now about 1%. This is self-inflicted, it's autonomous, and it's confined to the North. There's no world crisis. There's only a crisis of the North. So I think that's a very fundamental thing that, as far as I can see, is just not understood by the people who are formulating US policy, that if the US and everybody else does not radically change, and when I say radically, it's not a question of a little stimulus, it's a question of the state becoming massively involved in the organization of production, overriding the use of the profit motives as the prime driver of the way that investment is allocated. If it doesn't do that, it's going to carry on losing. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think it's very dangerous, because it's blaming the wrong person. It's not the global North elites. They're not understanding their own role in what's happening.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alan. So how shall we do this? I know that the first question from, I think it was Dan, was directed towards Aliyek and Jenny, I think. So please go ahead. And I think one of John's questions was also directed towards Oleg. And Oscar, you're on my list, so I'll come to you later. Yeah. Who wants to go first? Is Oleg here? Oleg, you're muted, Oleg.
Okay. I'll try to be short. So my key impression of today's discussion that whatever is our topic, we still are discussing Russia. It's quite First, Mateusz's question about speeches of Putin and Xi Jinping in the virtual Davos, and there is also it's connected with the earlier question of Mick Danford post in the chat at the beginning of our conference on Putin's question on Putin's speech on New Asia, new center of the world, and so on. That's true that both of them, Putin and Xi Jinping, they are proposing some economic alternatives. It's sure that now maybe just connecting with what Alan presented to us in his infographics, yeah, we can see that now the only major country who was in surplus of its GDP after the 2020 was China. All other countries were losing in GDP from 4 to 10 or maybe more percent because of Russian autarky and Russian semi-autarky and Russian sanctions. We lost quite less than the Western countries because the Russian GDP lost about 4-5% last year. And it's quite interesting. So the question is, yes, they propose these economic alternatives. It's nevertheless, at least for Russia, I don't know how it's for China, it is connected with the geopolitical alternative as well. But the key point is the long-term Chinese growth, economic growth, and then political growth. And if you'll see the text from 1990s, the CIA forecasts, some other texts, so everybody was writing that in 50 years and 60 years and 70 years, China will be the country #1, and what we can to do with it. There was also a term of non-Western globalization and so on. So the Chinese rise was quite predicted for already 20 or 30 years. Now we face it as a reality. Now we face China as an economic leader. Sure that some other countries are now tempted to choose between the United States-led globalization and at the same time to participate in the Chinese projects like Belt and Road and so on. And that's interesting because the problem is if the US will follow the way to demonize China and to make China absolutely toxic and also economically toxic as they do with Russia. So that will be the problem, let's say some smaller country in Asia or in Africa, whether it will be punished by the United States if it will follow some economic contracts with China. Let's take some country, I don't know, just an abstract example. Let's take Tanzania or Kenya or Ethiopia. Whether China is quite active and they are investing in the road infrastructure and so on, whether Ethiopia or Tanzania will be punished by the United States, whether it will be sanctioned by the United States. That will mean, if yes, that will mean that the world will be economically divided into the American sphere and the Chinese sphere. If Ethiopia or Tanzania will not be punished by the United States, so the China will continue its peaceful rising without any problem, I would say.
Thank you very much, Aliyek. I think, Jenny, you also had a question directed towards you.
Yes, about the Chinese Youth Organization. I think that, you know, it's quite normal for the Chinese Communist Party and its organizations to have links with other parties and organizations all around the world. My impression is at the moment that young people in China are red, if you like, and there's a bit of a revival in Maoism. I think that the youth organization is really as united, you know, a part of the Communist Party, as I was talking about at the beginning. And I don't think that we can think of it as going off in some independent direction. So I'd have a question mark about that. But I wonder, Radhika, if I could actually respond to some of the points that have come up in the discussion.
Of course.
And maybe sort of bring in some, draw in some of the other points that have been made. I mean, first of all, I appreciate very much the arguments that have been put by our Indian comrade, which I entirely agree with, but I do see some weak spots. You know, Obama, you know, there's going to be a lot of restraint on Biden. I take it that he's an astute diplomat, but there's going to be very limited room for what he can actually do. And if you actually look at what happened to Obama, Obama came under huge pressure from the Pentagon over China. He didn't want to send the freedom of navigation exercises into the South China Sea, but he had to do so. And I think that we can't rule out the question of war. We have to consider accident, and we also have to consider miscalculation under nationalistic pressures. And when you're in a game of chicken, these are the kind of risks that you take. And if there's some kind of contretemps, you know, then it builds up the national pride and the whole thing goes out of control. I think somebody also, Michelle, I think it was, mentioned the media and the media pressure that is being put on Biden and Merkel. You know, these are constraints. And when we see the Western media, this is a pure exercise in Orientalism. It's not about China, it's about a made up China. You know, let's not forget Said. This is a complete construction. And coming from a country that's just committed economic suicide through Brexit, I think somebody talked about economic suicide. Perhaps this is the most difficult thing. This challenge is the most difficult thing for China to handle. On the question of human rights, I think John Ross has already suggested it. You know, there are two sets of human rights, and the West only sees the liberal side. Now, China, on the question of the Uyghurs, is coming out very strongly, posing a different dialogue. How the Uyghurs have benefited, rises in life expectancy, falls in infant mortality, rises in education, improvements in jobs, and all of this kind of thing. And this was on display at Anchorage. And, you know, even my friends that aren't particularly interested in politics were saying, I didn't believe what he said to the US, talking about racial discrimination. If they're going to charge China with genocide, this brings up all the genocides that the West has carried out and is still carrying out. So I think that is the ideological ground, and it is being fought. China is fighting it. And the last thing I want to take up is Oleg's point about the temptation of the liberals. You know, I do think that this is a weakness in China, that there is a contradiction between the capitalist class and the Communist Party. And that contradiction can only sharpen. The Chinese Communist Party has always said you could deal with even antagonistic contradictions you can deal with in a non-antagonistic fashion. If you look back to what happened in China in 1946, from 1946 to 1949, they were involved in a life and death struggle. This was more Chinese soldiers were lost in the Red Armies at that time than in the fight against the Japanese. The huge sacrifice. They got rid of Japanese imperialism was ended. They were not going to have American imperialism instead, and they fought tooth and nail against that. The national bourgeoisie at that time held up their hands and said, yes, okay, we'll follow the Chinese Communist Party leadership, because they can see what the Chinese people are capable of and where the Chinese people's hearts were. And as I said, you know, this document does not talk about the PLA, and the big difference, the big lesson that China took away from the collapse of the Soviet Union was the lack of support from the military. And you know, that's not the case, and it's not going to be the case in China. So I just wanted to get those things in. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to abuse my chair privileges by simply inserting another question. I would love to hear more about essentially what this Biden administration strategy, which has definitely become extremely hardline towards both China and Russia, calling Putin a killer, for example, and so on. How is this playing out, particularly in Europe? Which way will Europe go? What are the main elements that will determine Europe's response to this? But having done that, I'm going to ask Bruno, Jean-Pierre Page, and Oscar to pose their questions. Bruno, please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to ask one of the panels, what are the real perspectives of economical communication and trade integration of Asia and Eurasia, not only China and Russia, but also ASEAN, Pakistan, Iran, eventually India and Turkey? And opposed to that, what are the real perspectives of the US so-called Indo-Pacific Alliance? Because I think that the economical integration of one sphere or the other are a basic question.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Wonderfully brief and to the point. Jean-Pierre.
At this time?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. On Europe, and also I would like to say a few words about Indo-Pacific. I think there's a lot of pressure from Biden administration on the European Union to take Europe on their side in their confrontation with China. But it is not so simple. Of course, we have a very important media campaign in Europe about China, you know, about Uyghur, the Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, and everything. But I think that the US are trying to get the European Union on their side by trying to manage the problem with Russia. I mean by that okay, you have a threat with Russia, we're going to be with you to confront Russia, but in exchange, you have to help us on China. Okay, so it is not so simple because reality is reality. And as it has been shown, I mean, you know, the situation in Europe, not only because of the pandemic, the situation.
10 minutes? Yeah.
The situation in Europe is quite bad. I mean, you know, economically, socially, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. And now the European Union has a huge problem of credibility for their people and also internationally. So they have to manage the contradiction. And just imagine, I mean, if Europe accept the US condition, the pressure of the US, what would happen? For example, with Russia, we are dependent on Russia for 30% of consumption of gas. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? So this is one of the contradictions that we are facing. I mean, at least for the US, the problem with treasury bonds, it's exactly the same. I mean, if China decide to ask the US to resolve the problem of the debt they have with China, how the US are going to manage? That's reality. And it's the same thing, I believe, regarding Asia. There's a huge challenge with this concept of Indo-Pacific. And what the United States are trying to do to unite as much as possible forces on their side against China in the their conflict with China. We can see, for example, it is very significant what's happening now with Sri Lanka. Okay. But in the same time, the contradiction is reality is always, we have to look at reality and the situation as it is. China has a very important kind of cooperation with most of the Asian countries. Most of the, look, for example, this historical free trade agreement, which has been signed with China and 15 other countries in Asia, it's the biggest, the largest, most important free trade agreement in the world. And we can continue like this, including India, because I agree there is this big challenge between India and China. But in the same time, and this is also the contradiction, the exchange, the commercial trade between China and India have never been so important. So we have to deal with all those aspects. And I finish with one thing, take the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Now it involves 76 countries in the world. 76 countries are involved with that initiative, which represent $1,600 billion of investment. This is exactly 10 times more than the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. So this is the problem of the United States. They have to take this in consideration. But as it has been said, and I agree totally, fully, the problem for the US is to take in consideration what is reality and the reality of the balance of forces today. And the way they behave, of course, shows, and the longer telegram is a very good example of this, is that it's a denial of reality. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was more of an answer to some of the questions, but that's great. I think we will take one last question from Oscar, and then I'm going to give all the panelists a chance to respond. I know Oleg has one thing he wants to respond to in particular, and then we should wrap up because we've already been going in this. Time flies when you're having fun. We've been going for a little over 2 hours. Okay, Oscar, please.
Yes, can I share my screen, please?
Yes, 1 second. There you go.
Okay, no, it says that you have, here we are. As to the question of how the world is faring, whether it is because the West invested in China or not, what we can see here is that the US GDP as a share of world GDP has been going down since 1960. It ends in 2017. But here what's important is how China takes off in about 2005. And the other thing that is interesting is how Japan made its inroads to compete with the US as leader, and the war of the US against Japan, as we all remember with the Plaza Accord, tumbled the Japanese economy, went back down with an economic crisis of a massive size. Now, here we have then China growing as share of world GDP. This share at the current rates, now that the US stopped in 2020 and China grew in 2020, and the projections for China for 2021 is 6.2% growth, what we're now expecting is that these two curves will meet in 15 years' time. That's one thing. The other thing here is the switch in 2020 from the Atlantic basin as a center of world growth, the consolidation to Asia. The only country that does not have a contraction of all of these countries, this is Latin America and the Caribbean, the G7 countries, and the ASEAN +3. The only one that does not contract in 2020 is China. And the one that has the highest growth in 2021 is China. This, given the previous graph, what we're now saying is that the world economy from now on is consolidated in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific basin, and no longer in the Atlantic basin, which means that there's a loss of relevance of Europe, at least from a Latin American point of view, and there is a growing relevance of Asia in several aspects. This makes, for Latin America, it makes it a playing field for the war between the US and China. Because for us, it's in the Indo-Pacific. The US is not going to want this to happen. The Chinese investments in Latin America are growing very fast. They have built 11 ports, and they are now building transcontinental roads and trains. So we're speaking of a massive investment in China, in Latin America, that the US never made, that was not interested in making, and that certainly weakens the US, at least in Latin America, and I think the same case is for Africa. So what we now have is a weakening US, and it is weakening very fast, and a strengthening China. In that context, this, the text written of the longer telegram, to me sounded like nonsense. It sounded like the people who were writing this did not understand what is really going on in the world. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Oscar, if you, yeah, don't mind. Great. Okay, I'm definitely going to let Aliyek have his chance, and whoever else among the panelists would like a brief response, please let me know one way or the other. Aliyek, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry I've missed the question of John Ross from the previous round. Is there any way out from the constant failures of the Russian economic neoliberal strategies? In fact, I don't see any exit, any way out, at least during the current regime and establishment. So for us, we have some discussions whether we should go, we should follow a policy of reindustrialization, Trump-style reindustrialization, at least. But it was not realized. But Radhika, you mentioned that you plan some other discussion on Russia. Maybe you ask Boris Kagarlitsky and some others more politically connected people to also to participate in. But me personally, I don't see nowhere. And just very briefly on question of integration in Asia versus Indo-Pacific. From my point of view, all was started by Obama, when Obama was promoting the ideas of Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and transatlantic investment partnerships. So it all understood that both these ideas were anti-Chinese, in fact. And based on this logic, China started to organize this Belt and Road Initiative as a direct response to Obama's projects, from my point of view. Now we'll see whether Biden will relaunch this project of Obama or no. But still, we now have Belt and Road Initiative as a huge reality with 70-something countries, as Jean-Pierre says. And I think now maybe the question is not of economic disbalance between two blocks, but the military one also, because if we say Indo-Pacific, we mean the Quad, we mean the military cooperation between India and the United States. So, and maybe the key challenge for the Chinese leadership would be, in fact, in position not of Russia, from my point of view, but from India. Whether India will follow totally anti-Chinese logic and will become the real military ally of the United States, it's one scenario. Whether India will become neutral and follow on its own path, as Ambassador Khadr Kumar said, it will be a totally different scenario. So India is the key factor in all these various things. Thanks.
I have requests for brief interventions from Michael and Jeffrey. And so, yeah, please go ahead, Michael and then Jeffrey.
Yeah, I can be very brief. Two comments. Firstly, I totally agree with the position expressed by several speakers that the longer telegram is not taking reality into account, but there's a German saying that illusions are the easiest way to hell. And this can be true also in this case. The second, I want just to support the position of Jean-Pierre about the ideological dimension of this situation. And of course, it is related to the problem of communism. It is related to the understanding what is democracy. And there I think on the one hand, there is a weak point also from the Chinese side, because they have a lot of trouble to express the values of their way beyond their idea that it is socialism with Chinese characteristics, market society with Chinese characteristics, and so on, it's democracy with Chinese characteristics. The challenge, I think, for the global left is that we are missing a theory which is embedding the different experiences and the contradictions of economy, of democracy, and so on into a universal framework. Yeah? And if this is, we are not able to do so, develop such a framework and to make it, to develop it, we are all put in a situation we have to, that we are, let's say, at least in Germany, in Europe, and I think not only here, that, or in the United States, that we are accused to be anti-democratic, to be anti-human rights persons, and so on. Yeah? And so to start our own offensive, we need theory and a common framework to deal with these contradictions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Misha. Jeffrey. You are still muted.
Audio on?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just a quick comment regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Of course, you know, the moment is too late on that. While it's proposed, is alluded to at least, as a possible solution to the crisis that the U.S. faces. I mean, it was something that could have perhaps been done during the Obama administration, but its moment is too late. China has grown, even in the short interim, just too much. It's an imperfect analogy, but you know, the idea was to create something along the lines of a UK or French 1930s era, you know, regional trading bloc in which you grouped your colonies, or in this case, your kind of neo-colonies, or at least your allies that had some concerns about China, and put them in an intellectual property regime in which the US would preside over the rents that would then be extracted from the region, while also providing some military protection. It's just not going to work today. The United States is no longer sufficiently robust and healthy to produce the level of digital and artificial intelligence technology to compete with China going forward. So it's just not going to happen. But there's also this, you know, thought that, well, the United States has faced this before. It confronted it with Japan in the 1980s, and it was thought that Japan was going to supersede the US, and then the United States by the 1990s shoots ahead based on its lead in digital technologies. But there again, you know, in the 1990s, the United States was just a couple of decades out from its peak point of investment in R&D, but today that's a half century in the rear view window. We can't rely on the big investments that produced the internet and the microprocessing chip a half century ago to find something new to draw upon today to commercialize that would give the United States a lead. By contrast, China is just really, really outpacing the US in terms of R&D.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. That's a really great segue into the concluding comment that I wanted to make, which is simply that if you think about it, your mention of Japan and China was very apropos, because if to me, what the longer telegram shows, and the chief reason why it is delusional, is because it takes no account of the long-term decline of the American economy, and the inability of anything that we have seen so far to revive it. In a certain sense, what was really remarkable about Oscar's graph showing how Japan was catching up and then declining, what's really remarkable about it is the reason why Japan could not go all the way to challenging American supremacy is that Japan is paying, began soon after that high point in its growth, began paying the price of keeping the Japanese economy capitalist. I think the real lesson the world is going to have to learn is that if any country wishes to continue sustained growth, to create and continue sustained growth, it can no longer be done on a capitalistic basis. Countries will have to move more and more towards China. So everybody is banging their drums about, how people want to partner with China. But I think increasingly, China will also have to become something of a model. This is not to say China is getting everything right, but simply to point to all the things that it is getting right. So I think that, and essentially to perpetuating a capitalist class in power, giving it the reins of the economy when it has absolutely no desire to invest, is the real problem of Western economies. So anyway, I think I just wanted to add that to this absolutely fascinating range of conversations. It's too bad that Bhadrakumar had to leave, that Georgi had to leave early, but I think it's been fascinating. Thank you to all the panelists. I've benefited an enormous amount from this. This present panel is, I think, the fourth of a great series with which we kicked off this year, beginning with Venezuela and the Europe in the new Cold War, and then the one on unpacking China's trade deals. And now we are going to, of course, we are going to have a planning session next week, next fortnight, but soon after that, you will hear about our future panels. So hope to see you all here in the future. And thanks very much. And thanks again to all the panelists. Okay, bye-bye.